I'm here today with Diana Butler Bass. Diana is an award-winning author, popular speaker, inspiring preacher, and one of America's most trusted commentators on religion and contemporary spirituality, especially where faith intersects with politics and culture. She holds a doctorate in religious studies from Duke University. Her bylines include the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN.com, Atlantic.com, USA Today, many, many others. She's commented on the media widely on all the major networks. And she, of course, has written several books, including Grateful, Grounded, Christianity After Religion, Christianity for the Rest of Us, and A People's History of Christianity. Diana has also spoken at many different Writing for Your Life events, and it's always such a pleasure to have her with us. So, Diana, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Brian. It's a book birthday day, so it's always the happiest of days.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's why we're here today. Actually, when we're recording this is the introduction of Diana's latest book, Freeing Jesus, Rediscovering Jesus as Friend, Teacher, Savior, Lord, Way, and Presence. And if I could, Diana, I'd like to read a couple of the endorsements that you've got for this book because I think they're so outstanding. So here's one from Anne Lamott. One of only a few modern Christian writers who can absolutely blow me away with both spiritual insight and beautiful writing. She speaks for me in Freeing Jesus as in all her books. That's just really a wonderful endorsement. I mean, Anne Lamott doesn't say things like that, right? Very often.
When I got that email with the endorsement in it from my publisher, I had to be picked up off the floor. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I was so humbled and surprised, and I couldn't even believe the words I was reading on the page. So I feel very grateful.
That certainly was not some canned, thing, right? And not that she would do that, right? But I mean, that I just thought that was amazing. And here from Bill McKibben too, I think is another great one. With each new book, Diana Butler Bass goes more deeply into what it means to be a Christian now, in a moment when many can't summon the energy or the hope required. This may be her finest yet. So another really nice, I think, statement about this book, Diana.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't know, but over the years, Bill McKibben's writing, as well as his passion about environmentalism and climate change, has been deeply influential on my thought and in my work. And yeah, it's interesting because the vice versa has been true as I've written about church and faith in the 21st century and how things are changing. I did not know that Bill was reading all of my books. And so in the last 18 months or so, we finally really talked about that. And it's been a real joy to know that there was another author, person I admire so much, who had been influenced by the work I've been doing as well. And so I love that feeling of being together with great writers and the idea that we're healing the world from all these different angles. And so, yeah, I was very pleased with what Bill said too. Very gracious. He's a very gracious person.
And, the kind of community of other writers, that you're with and part of, Brian McLaren and Jackie Lewis and, all the rest. It's just really great to see how much you all support each other.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. As a writer, you spend so much of your time in isolation. You just are working at your desk. And I'm an extrovert by nature. So the working at my desk part is really tough. And I love being around people. So when we get a chance, and visiting one another's cities or being at a conference together, it's always such a gift. And so there is a real way in which this kind of larger coterie, I think, of Christian writers has formed community. And we care about each other. And it also helps to deflate, I think, some of the pitfalls of writing around competition or feeling envious, of other people's work. And, I just feel like a cheerleader for great books and great work, and have learned a lot from having colleagues. So it's almost, it's like a community but it is spread out over the country. So since I like people so much, I'm always hungry for their actual physical company. I feel deprived of it this year.
Yeah, yeah.
Very deeply.
Well, soon we'll be able to be back to that, I hope so.
Yeah, I do too.
So tell us about this new book and how this came about. I mean, you've written so many amazing books. How do you keep coming up with these amazing, results?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Brian McLaren, because Freeing Jesus has a sort of a relationship to the new book that Brian has out this year, Faith After Doubt. And they both emerged from pretty much the same place. 2 years ago, we were speaking at Ring Lake Ranch, which is this beautiful, amazing place in the Wyoming wilderness. And one afternoon, we were sitting on the porch of this cabin, and we were on, believe it or not, on rocking chairs looking out over this beautiful lake up in the mountains. And we started talking about what we wanted to do next. And both of us had turned 60. I was just barely there. Brian is a couple years older than me. And we were thinking about what does it mean to be a writer, to gather up the wisdom that we've learned, over decades. And so we started talking about developmental spirituality and different phases of our own lives and how we had grown. And we realized that there would be this wonderful kind of narrative framework you could put around theology or memoir and create stories that were resonant with the different stages of life. And so we both kind of got intrigued by the idea, and I didn't realize until later we had both picked up the exact same idea, and we were writing from that perspective of that conversation in Wyoming. And so Brian wound up writing a larger book about theology, faith more generally, especially in relationship to what happens when faith breaks down at these various stages, what happens when doubt, emerges. And I took a slightly different tact. And instead of writing about theology in general, I wrote very specifically about Jesus. So books come from odd places, and that's probably one of the oddest in some senses. And then, what Brian and I discovered, we had actually been so influenced by this conversation. It wasn't until we were well underway in writing both of these books that we realized we were moving in a very similar direction. So the books kind of, if you have them side by side and you're reading them, there's a way in which they almost sound like they're cousins, book cousins, as it were. So that's kind of where it came from. And the idea of focusing on Jesus emerged out of a lot of conversations with my own publisher, and the fact that I'd never actually tackled writing a book about Jesus before. So it just sort of seemed right.
Well, to your point, when Amazon, on their website will put different books frequently bought together, they've got your book and Brian's new book, Faith After Doubt, and Barbara Brown Taylor's latest book, Always a Guest. The three of those are the package, that they're promoting. So, not surprising.
No, it doesn't seem surprising to me at all. And what, like I said, great company. I'm happy to be in it. It would make a wonderful dinner party. So, but that's the great thing about books, in effect, is that when you can't sit down at dinner with authors you really like, you can actually create a dinner party, in effect, around the words that they share in the world. And so that to me is one of the miracles of writing, is that it always creates a relationship. Good writing creates a relationship with the readers and creates relationships between readers, so that community then multiplies and everyone is welcome at that table.
It's really true. I mean, I find this area to be so much less competitive than any other business that I've ever been in.
Wow.
And part of it, I think, is just the people, the nature of the people. But part of it also is that, if somebody's going to like a Brian McLaren book, they're going to like a Diana Butler Bass book, and vice versa, and several others too. So it actually helps if the authors cooperate instead of compete.
Well, I think that, it's not always quite so planned, but a lot of the people that I care about and who are, really good writers, many of the names that you've already mentioned, they're very attentive people. You ask the question, where does this book come from? Well, books come from conversations that you have with a friend sitting on a porch in Wyoming, or um, so why did Brian and I get to that point where we were talking about the exact same thing on that day? Well, it was because we were paying attention to the flow of time, paying attention to our own lives, paying attention to what was going on in the world. And that's always the first step of a new book, is paying attention to how the world is speaking to you, as well as how your heart is speaking to you. So it particularly surprised me that writers who care about Christianity in particular, is all these writers are Christian that we're talking about, Christianity in particular, but spirituality more generally, a lot of us oftentimes are hearing, kind of similar notes that are sounding in the culture. And then it's not an issue that we're writing the same book, because nobody writes the same book, but we're taking the same material and running it through our lenses and our experiences, and creating a sort of a story that makes sense within the time in which we all live. And so, that's actually really quite important for Freeing Jesus, because when I sat down to write a book about Jesus, the first thing that came to my mind was, what can I say? Here's a guy who lived 2,000 years ago.
There's already been a little bit written about him.
Yeah. I mean, how many books have been written about Jesus, and why in the world would I even care to tackle this gigantic subject? And the thing that sort of propelled me as I moved into the project more deeply was, well, yes, but I've never written a book about this subject. I've never written a book about Jesus. And that means that the story that I have to tell hasn't been told or shared in the world yet. And it doesn't matter about those thousands of others. I mean, those are great books and they influence me, but I mean, I don't have to think about that there's no space left for my book on a shelf, even with thousands and thousands of books, because there's always space on a shelf for another way of telling even a very familiar story.
Well, I mean, I think that's really such a great example for, newer writers, because a lot of them, I think, get a little intimidated about that, where's the space for me? Everything's already been said. And here's a really good, I mean, like we just said, I mean, how many books have already been written about Jesus? And here you've come up with another one that's really good, really insightful. And, oh, by the way, given kind of the course of American Christianity recently, a lot of things that need to be said. So
yeah, I've thought about this so much in the last year. Yeah, I mean, there's so many ironies that are embedded in this book in certain ways. First of all, the title is Freeing Jesus, and it was written during pandemic lockdown. And so there's this undertow of, why in the world is this woman writing about freedom in the time in which millions and millions and millions and millions of people around the world have felt the most constraint that they've ever felt? And so there's this story about what sets us free. And, I had to think while I was writing, and this doesn't actually show up in the book, but it certainly was in my heart as I was working on this project, is how many people in church history, how many really, truly great saints felt like they got to know Jesus better when they were in prison. And I mean, you can literally go down the list of half of my heroes, Dorothy Day, she's in prison all the time, and and that becomes sort of part of almost a spiritual practice for her in how she knows God, how she knows justice, how she knows Jesus more deeply. Oscar Romero, you've got Nelson Mandela. And those are just the modern examples. You go through church history, and the people that have been most influential in my life are always the people who were silenced by authorities, actually put in prison, somehow forced through some part of their lives into isolation and silence. And it was in those places that some of their best theology emerged. So there was that thread of it for me as a writer, writing a book about freeing Jesus, but doing it while I couldn't have my normal life. And it became this really powerful spiritual experience for me that I hope the energy of that is in the pages. So there's that aspect of it. And then this other aspect that you point out so beautifully, while the book was in its very, 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 very final stages, just as it was all being sent off, to the publisher, everything is finally done. The insurrection at the Capitol happened on January 6th. And to watch that on television and see, how many of the signs outside of the Capitol were being paraded in the midst of this, riot, had the word Jesus on them, was really, sad and shocking and hurtful to me. And I thought, well, this is very strange, because in effect, these people who are acting this way, very violently, I think in ways against the common good and politically destructive ways, they kind of want to free Jesus too, because they are always those same people are always saying that their freedoms are being inhibited. Then they want to be free. And yet they have a different kind of a vision, I think, of what freedom means and what Jesus means. And so that vision that they presented on that day has become part of our cultural and political language, I'm afraid. And so my book really speaks something quite different than that, about both freedom and Jesus. And so in that sense, there becomes I think it in some ways is the least overtly political book I ever wrote, but it probably is the one that has the greatest social consequences, and therefore also political sorts of implications that I've written. Even though the subject is I don't think I ever really. I do talk about the development of the moral majority in the book, but that's really about the only place where I address a specific political or social movement. Otherwise, the book is quite focused really on theology and the Bible and my own personal experience. So both of those things are really at play. This personal sort of struggle between freedom and constraint that I was experiencing, that we were all experiencing this last year. So I hope that people will resonate with the book there. But then also this picture that is emerging in our culture of a Jesus that talks about freedom, but does so in ways that are what I believe to be counter to Jesus's essential message. And so how do we free Jesus from the signs around the Capitol during the day of the insurrection and be able to talk about Jesus and freedom in ways that are life-giving and add to a life of justice?
So is unhijacking a word?
There you go. I don't know, but I like it.
Because it kind of feels like, that's another way of saying freedom, a poor way, but I mean, another way of saying freeing Jesus.
Yeah, in effect, it really is. I do tell this story about when I had my first date with my husband, Richard, and we were talking about all sorts of things. He loves Emerson. That was one of our major points of conversation over that brunch 25 years ago now. And one of the things he said in the course of that conversation was, I'm really glad to talk to you, and he really was appreciative that I was so open about my own faith journey and where I was. He looks and says, I'm really kind of angry at the fundamentalists. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, because I feel like they've hijacked, he used that exact language. I feel like they've hijacked Jesus. And it was at that point that, the lunch ended, and I thought, I'm going to go get him a book that I recently read that helps turn that around. And I ran down to what was then Borders in Santa Barbara, where I was living, and bought a copy of Marcus Borg's book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time.
Oh, that's great.
Which is a book about unhijacking Jesus from fundamentalists. That was written in 94, 93. I didn't realize
it was that old.
Yeah, something like that. It's way early mid 90s. And so I bought that book, and I took it over to Richard's house, and it's just kind of forward, after your first date, giving somebody a present. But I said, he still got the copy of it down in his office. And I wrote it something to the effect of, this book will help you take Jesus back from the fundamentalists. And so my book does a very similar kind of thing. It helps people take the book back from fundamentalists, if that's what you need to have Jesus taken back from. But it does so in a surprising way. It does so, I think, without anger. I think it actually says that anger is probably not the most effective strategy.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. It really is a book about integrating our lives and learning to see our own stories with far more sympathy than we sometimes employ towards ourselves, learning how to forgive ourselves when we make bad choices and things like that. So it's not a book I would have written 10 years ago.
Interesting. Well, you and I are working together on another project about healing divides, right? And so, it's clear that anger is not the right way to do that either.
Yeah, I think that probably, just when you even say that, I think that probably one of the major things I learned while I was writing the book was how to stop, how not to have a divide within myself. And my experience that shows up in the book, because the book is what I call an act of memoir theology. So I take my life as the primary text and run the text of my life next to the text of the Bible, the text of theology, the text that involves Jesus, and try to weave those things together. And in doing that, I talk about how I grew up United Methodist, so I was born into a liberal Protestant mainline tradition in the middle part of the 20th century. And then I became an evangelical, and I chose that for myself. In high school, I started going to a church called Scottsdale Bible Church. And eventually, after about 17 or so years, I would say it was between 15 and 20 years, even our own lives, sometimes it's hard to figure out the time frame. But it was almost 2 decades. I understood myself to be an evangelical, and for most of the time, a pretty conservative evangelical. And so then a whole bunch of other stuff happened, and I wound up being a very progressive Episcopalian, which is how people know me now.
Yes.
And so what I did in this book is I went back into all those stories, those earlier stories, most of which I had not told in public. And I try to tell my stories of Jesus at these earlier stages in such a way that I was able to free myself from the kind of judgment I had put on myself. It's like, when I talk about Scottsdale Bible to my friends, for example, who before this book was written, I would just sort of shake my head. It's like, how did I ever do that? Why would I ever join a church like that? What was I thinking? And in a sense, I was cutting off part of my own life, part of my own experience. But in this book, I literally gave myself permission to go back to being that 15-year-old girl sitting around a campfire in the backyard, somebody's house in Scottsdale, Arizona, singing "I Wish We'd All Been Ready," and having these very sort of intensive Bible studies and witnessing to our friends in high school and all these things. And I went back to her, and I realized why that was also important to me at the time and how much it had given me. And so I've never written about that stuff sympathetically before.
Wow.
And yet here I was doing that. And I literally found a sense of freedom by forgiving myself. But what I had not understood is that I was holding myself sort of accountable for standards that would develop later for me intellectually and spiritually. And so I couldn't love the 15-year-old girl anymore. She was silly, and yet that's still me. So I had to forgive that 15-year-old, but I wound up just forgiving her for being 15. And once I realized that, it was kind of wonderful. It was like, oh, of course I did this, because it was the most logical thing that I could have done at the time. And it made sense. And it actually became springboard for becoming the person I am now. So there's a lot of that kind of work that happens in this book. And I was really tickled because one of the first reviews that came out was from a reviewer in Kansas City, and he literally wrote in the review that I was an evangelical. And I read that at first, was like, oh my gosh, how could he get to that? Yeah, how could he come to that conclusion? And and then I realized I wrote about being an evangelical at a time when it's popular to bash evangelicals. I wrote about being an evangelical with so much sympathy that this reviewer thought that I still was one. And I went, oh, well, that's actually a great thing for a writer to have accomplished,
Really?
And so at that point I just sent him a little note and I said, I'm sorry if I confused you. But I think I wrote about my own experience with so much empathy that you thought I still was an evangelical. And I'm not. I said I'm proudly a liberal Protestant. And he wrote back to me. He goes, whoa.
That's wild.
Yeah. So in a sense, I'm setting Jesus free to, roam around in my memory and my life as Jesus. I sort of just gave permission to all these different Jesuses I've known to show up again for me. And in that showing up to teach me anew what I needed to know in this really difficult moment for our societies. So that's the book, and it wound up being far deeper and more vulnerable, I think, than probably I first imagined it to be. It's also very funny. People have commented to me that it's the funniest thing I've ever written.
Really?
There are some laugh out loud parts of it.
Okay.
When you're writing about a 15-year-old sitting around a campfire in Scottsdale, Arizona, singing.
I don't even want to think about when I was 15 years old, honestly.
Yeah, see, if you can write about that with sympathy, you really do. It really becomes kind of funny, because we all laugh very empathetically, about ourselves, at those ages. So there's a lot of stories I tell that are funny for their idealism or their naivete or just the fact that I was the person I was. And so that's great. And then there's lots of tears in this book too.
Wow.
So anyway, that's
what an interesting
Jesus
story, right? I mean, interesting saga, so to speak, that you've revealed here. I mean, it's much different than the other books that you've read.
It is. I think that my readers will recognize certain themes that reemerge, because there are certain ideas that keep showing up in my books over and over again. Ideas about tables and circles and hospitality and mysticism and some other things that are constant themes in my book. And they're all in Freeing Jesus. But it shows up in such a different way that I just really hope that this book functions as an invitation for people to go back into their own lives, to forgive themselves of what needs to be forgiven. And when you talk about healing our divides, I actually believe that when we can forgive ourselves, that becomes a step towards healing our public divides.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because so often what we do is we externalize the things that we haven't dealt with in our own hearts. We externalize what we haven't forgiven about our own experience towards others. And so if we can't forgive that 15-year-old girl at the Bible church, how in the world can I ever have a real conversation with a 40-year-old guy who thinks that Jesus told him to, invade the Capitol? And so, not that I know that I want to have that conversation necessarily, but somebody at the local church, who sympathizes with that, why that happened and doesn't see it in the same framework I do. So I think that forgiving ourselves, that's why I think Jesus talks a lot about forgiveness. Forgiving ourselves is the first step towards a forgiveness that extends itself towards healing the world.
Well, you'll be happy to see some of the chapters in this book, the How to Heal Our Divides book, because they get at this area a little bit.
Oh, good, because it's really important. I think it is. That's one of the ways that we free ourselves, is by forgiving ourselves, and to tell that story through my experiences of Jesus, the one who embodies forgiveness. I think that it's a deeper and more surprising story than even I knew while I was writing it.
Well, it sounds like you've been very vulnerable, which, is really admirable.
As a writer, I don't quite know where else to go. I mean, you can write from artifice, and what happens when you write from artifice, you might even make a lot of money. Sometimes writers who write from artifice make a ton of money on their books, but I just can't. It's just I wouldn't feel right leaving behind books that didn't come from my deepest places.
Well, good for you. Thank you for doing this. I think it's a really important book right now, and I hope it really impacts a lot of people positively.
Thank you, Brian.
It helps them to rethink some things, and from a fresh perspective. So, well, Diana, it's really wonderful to see this, and thank you so much for sharing, the details about this and how it came about and your thoughts about it with everyone, and best of luck with the launch, and I really hope that it goes very well for you.
Well, thank you. I love to see how words move into the world. And I always remember some wisdom shared with me by Nora Gallagher, who's a writer I knew in California a couple decades ago and is a friend. When I wrote my very first book, she said to me, Diana, always hold on to the fact that books find their readers. And so that's always my prayer on launch day from my friend Nora from so long ago, is that this book, like my other books, will find its readers.
Well, I think that it will. I really hope that it will, and I pray that it will. And I'll help you try to do that a little bit. So, all right. Well, Diana, thanks again so much. Good luck with the rest of the launch. Thanks so much for all that you do.
Well, thank you, Brian. Your support for my work over the years is so appreciated. And I'm grateful to sit in a circle of friends with you.
Well, same here. My pleasure. Absolutely.